This river is the lifeblood of our communities.
The Verde is exceptional in this desert, always flowing and often flooding to regenerate habitat along the riverbed.
The Verde River supplies water to 2 million people in the Phoenix metro area.
With its latest project in the Negev Desert, Israel is praised as the country that makes deserts bloom. Pushing beyond nature's limits, Israel has stunned observers once again by building flowing rivers in the wilderness. This marvel of modern engineering has amazed the world, raising many big questions along the way. How did Israel manage to accomplish this now, and why is the result still so remarkable, even after decades of open planning and progress? Join us as we explore the story, the setbacks, and the engineering behind this incredible feat. The barren wastelands. Long before Israel was known as the country that makes deserts bloom, its future in farming, welfare, and agriculture was looking grim. The Negev Desert has always been a harsh environment, dry, barren, and unforgiving. It was a place where nothing could grow and nothing could survive without supply from elsewhere. But something unexpected was about to happen. By the late 20th century, the desert's natural limits had become impossible to ignore. The aquifers beneath Israel's southern regions, once the main source of fresh water, were pushed to their breaking point. What remained underground could barely be called water. Years of constant pumping and prolonged drought had reduced them to hollowed-out chambers underground. The water that remained tasted brackish, and wells that had served communities for generations produced little more than undrinkable liquid. To meet high demand, Israel relied on endless convoys of trucks carrying tons of fresh water across the desert, a sight so common that entire villages and military bases had grown used to waiting for them. But sadly, this solution came at an enormous cost. The fragile system was starting to fail, and much worse, the system depended on roads that flash floods swallowed and sandstorms blocked, creating new environmental and logistical problems. The method worked, but it was far from sustainable. People naturally looked west, toward the vast Mediterranean Sea, a body of water so enormous it seemed full of promise, yet almost entirely useless in its current state. Seawater couldn't be drunk, and fields could not be watered with it without expensive, energy-intensive desalination. Government officials had considered the idea for years, but the scale and cost of such a project kept it in endless policy debates, rising and falling with each new proposal. The question remained, could this endless sea ever become a lifeline for their water problem? This was the critical point, as the crux of the issue was never a lack of technology, but rather a lack of scale. The energy systems Israel could afford didn't come close to the standard needed for the project to work, and the upgrades needed to pull this off came at a cost that no government official was willing to pay. As expected, troubles escalated as the population grew and cultural practices across different farms increased. The Sea of Galilee, once known for its deep and rich depths, had now fallen to record lows more than once, leaving large stones at the shores that hadn't seen sunlight in centuries. As things got worse, scientists began to think of better ways of doing the project without spending so much. By the late 90s, the reports on the current state of the ecosystem had accumulated until the authorities admitted the problem needed to be addressed. So without any public appearance or king speeches, the old plans from as far back as the 50s officially got into policy, and by early 2001, something shocking was about to unfold. Barely a few months after the water policy was put out, to everyone's surprise later that year, Israel's water management system had begun to change drastically. In a matter of months, a system that relied on running trucks and rainfall was now becoming more innovative and diversified in its sources. By October of 2001, the popular consortium called VID was able to build the first underwater reverse osmosis system and won the tender needed to establish a water treatment plant in Ashkelon. This contract was given under a BOT scheme, and the plan was to give out at least 50 million cubic meters of water each year. Needless to say, this was a very ambitious project, and things only got more tense when the bar was raised even higher to supply 300,000 cubic meters each day. It seemed Israel was doing much more than it could handle, as the country was also making use of the new Lyman irrigation systems in the Negev Desert. These were shallow earthen dams that were built across the seasonal riverbeds. They were designed to slow down the runoff of flash floods and let the water infiltrate more naturally into the soil. Thanks to the KKL Jewish National Fund of that year, hundreds of these dams were built, and many drought-resistant plants were planted. These limans turned the barren valleys into small groves, adding more nutrients to the soil and reducing desertification. At the same time, Israel was testing the waters with treated sewage from the Tel Aviv metropolitan area and other populated centers for agriculture. Thanks to this process, Israel was now actively treating wastewater for irrigation and reducing stress on the freshwater aquifers that were already running out. Israel was now the leading nation in terms of water recycling. The future looked exciting on the surface, but underneath it all there was a big problem. Endless problems and setbacks. The first big issue popped up back in 2003, when the Ashkelon desalination plant. It turned out engineers already knew the Mediterranean coast would pay the cost of the entire desalination project, and the consequences were most apparent when the plant was in full swing by 2005. Contemporary studies showed the presence of a visible red plume discoloration in the water near the pitfall. This was caused by the ferric sulfate chemicals used to clean the seawater at the facilities before distribution to homes around the region. The discoloration kept spreading through the coast, so much so that later that year, the Ministry of Environmental Protection ordered the plant to use less iron and to stop releasing the brine in sudden bursts, because those bursts made the salty water gather too quickly in one spot. But this was just the start of many problems they would have to deal with. In 2009, leading ecologists studying the area near the Hadera desalination plant found that the facility was doing more harm than good to the environment.
Israel faces a significant shortage of potable drinking water, and so today I've come to the Hadera water desalination plant.
This issue was made apparent when it was discovered that small sea creatures called foraminifera were disappearing near the plant's outfall pipe. They knew this because researchers from Tel Aviv University had collected samples in August and November of 2009 and compared them to samples taken in 2007 before the plant existed. The new samples showed that the water had become too salty and the creatures could not survive well there. Keep in mind that this plant has just gotten into full operation, as it hadn't been up for a year after the initial discovery was made. Why were scientists worried about this? Because the animals getting wiped out were the foundation of Israel's marine ecosystem. Foraminifera, sometimes called forams, are tiny, single-celled animals that live in the sand and mud at the bottom of the sea. Even though they are very small, they are very important for the ocean, and driving them to extinction would bring serious harm to the environment. Sadly, the results are most evident today, as the growth of algae and bacteria along Israel's coastal regions has now gotten out of control. Today, green patches can be found on the water, and these blooms use up most of the oxygen in the water, creating dead zones across the waters where fish and other underwater animals cannot survive. Some visitors have reported getting bad smells from some areas on the beach, making swimming and moving by boat almost impossible. Research shows that animals like crabs, clams, and snails are currently searching for places to live as the coral and seagrass areas are beginning to shrink. The coastlines are eroding, and the after effects are beginning to affect the population in these areas. While the Hadera desalination plant was bringing water to many homes in the area, it was also making life harder for fishermen and locals, whose jobs relied on the steady flow of food from the waters. Dead zones and polluted beaches would make it harder for locals and tourists to enjoy the sea, and at this point, scientists could only imagine the ecological harm this could cause Israel's natural ecosystems, and, as we shall see, this was just one issue out of several. Just a few years later, in 2011, the OECD wrote in its Environmental Performance Review on the latest operations of Israel's 3 main desalination plants, and their results were beyond concerning. As it turned out, Ashkelon, Palmachim, and Hadera were raising salinity and changing water temperature along the coast. According to the report, from 2006 to 2010, an invasive species called the comb jelly had settled in the area. This species alone was responsible for the deaths of most aquatic life in the region, as it aggressively fed on the vital planktons that fueled the rest of the food chain. Various attempts were made by local scientists to tackle this issue. The problem was that the comb jelly reproduced very quickly, with one animal producing hundreds of offspring in just a few weeks. Thanks to this feat alone, the comb jelly was able to take over large chunks of the coast, ending every local ecosystem it finds as it goes ever deeper into the Mediterranean. Despite these issues coming to light, the Negev desalination plant was opened in 2013. It quickly became the largest operating water plant in the world, and as expected, many problems came with its success.
Drinking water, potable water from the sea is something Israel has pioneered and certainly shared with many parts of the world. We're at the world's largest desalination plant.
Various tests published in early 2014 were confirmed by Israel's Ministry of Health, showing that the drinking water produced had very low levels of magnesium. And through an official warning, it was also shown that consuming this kind of water wasn't good for human health and local farming. But that wasn't all. As confirmed by farmers in the western Negev, the 2014 growing season was the worst, with the soil becoming loose and unusable because the water produced by these plants no longer had the minerals found in regular water. Things got a lot worse in 2017 when diesel pollution near Ashkelon reached the plant's intake pipe, causing the factory to slow down for almost 2 days. The Mekarot system had to move water through the national water carrier to make sure people still had enough. When 2020 kicked off, another disaster sprang up when recycled water from the Shafdan facility showed growing salt levels that looked absurd. Worse yet, experts had warned about this possibility since 2008, and it took well over a decade before the authorities acknowledged there was a problem. Later on, a new study tested seawater near the Ashkelon, Palmachim, and Sorek outfalls and found genotoxic markers. These were portrayed as toxic chemicals dangerous enough to directly harm DNA. The samples were put under examination from March to July 2024, and even a year later, in early 2025, these chemicals were still found 2 kilometers away from the pipes. Scientists said this matched early warnings from 2012 when unusual chemical signs first appeared, but it would take over 12 years before the authorities have the issue much needed attention. Still, without changing too much, these 3 processes continued for over a decade, leading up to March of 2023, when a team of engineers and hydrologists decided to take things a step further, and what these men achieved was unbelievable. Rivers in the desert. These experts mapped a 120-kilometer corridor with LiDAR scanners and identified the gradients and depressions and ancient dry wadi channels that could guide water by gravity, without needing insane amounts of electrical power. But that didn't mean the process was cheap. These experts still needed to drill hundreds of core samples every few hundred meters for testing. To make sure this worked perfectly, they had to run several simulations with the samples found to determine how fast it would flow under different temperatures. This was very important, given how water peak temperatures easily reached over 45 degrees Celsius during the summer. Another part that still made the project expensive was the massive tracked excavators and automated hydraulic diggers. New supply lines had to be created for aggregate, and reinforced earth had to be used to stabilize the channel walls of the large rivers they were building. To keep those walls stabilized, the engineers had to rely on geotextile composites with buried steel lattice frames. This way, they would prevent both collapse under desert sand pressure and erosion once water began to flow in full force. The engineering became a lot more complicated with the most vulnerable stretches, where the engineers had to cast ultra-high-strength concrete linings to keep things tight. To prevent seeping and leaking, a multi-layer waterproofing system was built. The first step taken to achieve this was by lining the channel floor and banks with interlocking polymer geomembranes specially engineered to resist ultraviolet and thermal degradation. Over this fine line, another layer of geosynthetic clay was added as a self-sealing barrier. On top of that, they had to put a 30-centimeter thick layer of compacted sand and gravel to protect the membranes and allow controlled percolation that could support edge vegetation and prevent leaks. At various joints like the bends, pump inlets, and sluice gates, flexible polyurethane gaskets were used as reinforcements. The engineers went with this so the structures could easily expand when wet without breaking and maintain watertight seals despite the quick changes in temperatures. And then came the difficult part. Several tons of seawater were pumped from the Mediterranean into a high-capacity SWRO plant that followed the same design principles as the Ashkelon facility. This principle involved the taxing process of multi-stage RO, boron removal, and energy recovery. The plant was engineered for high efficiency, using energy recovery devices that reduced the effective energy consumption per cubic meter of fresh water. Once the water gets desalinated, it passes through a microfiltration chamber and multiple UV disinfection units before entering large buffer reservoirs. At the same time, the reclaimed water from existing sewage treatment locations was treated and blended to maintain ecological balance in the river. To regulate the flow along the river, the engineers relied on a network of electronically controlled sluice gates, variable speed pumps, and real-time monitoring. The sensors embedded at every few kilometers measured water, level, temperature, salinity, and turbidity. All the information was fed into a central operations center so that when evaporation or seepage threatened to drop levels, the highly advanced software would respond by adjusting gate openings and increasing pumping power. By early 2024, after months of hard work, the first controlled release of water occurred, and to the surprise and cheer of everyone involved, the positive results were clear. The places once dry and marked by cracked sand were now flowing with clear water. Looking back at the years when the country struggled with water supply, it's amazing to see how far it has come. Now we know that over 80% of Israel's water supply relies on the new rivers and older water projects. And today, the country is known as having one of the most advanced systems in the world. Thanks to the network for reclaiming wastewater, large-scale desalination processes, and water allocation systems, the country meets most of its domestic, agricultural, and industrial needs. However, this only covers what we see on paper. Despite the amazing effects these projects have had in the world, there have also been newer and bigger problems coming up as well, specifically with the technical, environmental, and social consequences of their latest projects. So what are the implications created by Israel's latest project, and what are the current plans made to solve these issues? Stay with us as we carefully put the clues together and find the answers. Ongoing problems and plans for the future. For example, while the country prides itself on having one of the most advanced desalination plants out there, its latest project involving rivers in the desert shows the country is now relying too much on desalination. And while this is understandable, given the country's geographical locations, it's also important to note that this country alone now operates 5 major plants that are working around the clock to supply domestic water. The issue comes with the process, as each step requires huge amounts of energy that still put stress on the country's economy. From pressurizing seawater, forcing it through membranes, and then treating it later, each step requires high levels of electricity supply, making the entire system vulnerable to energy price fluctuations, power disruptions, and fuel supply issues. These factors easily grow into water shortages and increased operational costs. Let's take farming, for example. Reports show that between 2000 and 2018, the amount of fresh water used for farming dropped a lot, from about 64% to 35%. And while this might look like a good thing on the surface, using recycled water so much also causes long-term problems for soil and underground water. Even after secondary and tertiary treatment by the water plants, treated wastewater can still have leftover nutrients, salts, or minute chemicals from fertilizers, factories, or other pollutants. As we've seen, all that's needed to destroy everything is a decade of agriculture and irrigation by farmers for the soil to grow salty and be unable to grow crops. Water that seeps down into the ground can also carry some of these leftovers into underground aquifers, affecting their quality. Existing technical problems are made worse by planning and management issues. Since most of Israel's water today comes from desalination and recycled wastewater, natural water sources like aquifers, springs, and rainfall-fed lakes have been less used and maintained over the years. This means less money and effort have been put into keeping the natural sources safe or restoring them. Some older wells and springs have been closed, and wells drilled before the 1970s are now at higher risk of damage and pollution. Predictions say that by 2065, water use could be 160% higher than in the early 2020s at the current rate. To meet this predicted demand, Israel would need to produce many more times its current supply, which could mean building dozens more desalination plants. Any delays in building could cause serious water stress. The problem is that doing so would only increase the already existing problems plaguing the nation's fragile ecosystems. But despite these endless problems, there seems to be hope on the horizon. To fix these issues and setbacks, Israel is taking several steps back, reworking all the steps that led to these problems. One solution recently brought up as policy is to artificially add minerals back into desalinated water. Magnesium and other important minerals can be carefully put into the water before it is sent to homes or farms. This way, the soil can always stay strong after irrigation and will be able to keep plants growing and healthy. The second solution currently under consideration by the government is using a mix of sources. Instead of relying only on desalination, farmers and cities would be encouraged to combine desalinated water with fresh water from rivers, lakes, and aquifers when possible. This helps keep attention on natural sources and maintains the minerals and nutrients that come naturally from these waters. It would also increase focus on maintaining these natural sources and taking care of them to prevent hazards like pollution and acts of God from destroying them. The third policy under examination is new laws aimed at improving soil management. Farmers are taught to add compost, fertilizers, and minerals to soil that gets mostly desalinated water. This stops soil from becoming brittle and salty. Finally, Israel is protecting and restoring natural water sources. Old springs, wetlands, and aquifers are organically cleaned, repaired, and monitored so they can provide water safely again. By keeping natural water in the system, Israel hopes to reduce pressure on desalination plants and keep the environment healthier. By constantly adding minerals to water, mixing water sources, caring for soil, and restoring natural water to the region, the nation's leaders hope to reduce the problems caused by relying too much on desalination. This way, farmers would have bigger harvests, fishermen would have better profits, the environment would be restored, and families would be healthy. Late 2025 shows Israel plans to use new technology to get clean water from the sea and save water in the desert. Scientists and engineers want to build better desalination plants, store water safely, and make sure farms and cities have enough. They also hope to raise awareness of the situation by smart ideas and hard work, hoping for the future to be safe, green, and full of water for everyone. Another new project is rumored to be announced in 2026, And until that happens, we just have to wait and see what the future has in store for Israel. So, what do you think? Will the new rivers built cause more problems than solutions for Israel's water crisis? Or will they be the solutions the nation has sought for over 70 years? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Also, click on the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.